Have you ever had a conversation that never actually happened? Maybe you were lying in bed, taking a shower, driving alone, or staring out a window, and suddenly you found yourself talking to someone in your head. Maybe it was an argument. Maybe it was a future conversation. Maybe it was a chance to finally say something you wish you had said years ago. The strange thing is, almost everyone does this, yet very few people talk about it. Psychology suggests that imaginary conversations are far more common than most people realize. And contrary to what many people think, they're not necessarily a sign that something is wrong. In fact, they may reveal something important about how your mind processes emotions, relationships, and experiences. Most people assume imaginary conversations happen because we're lonely, but that's only part of the story. Often, these conversations happen because the brain is trying to solve something that feels unfinished. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as cognitive closure. The human brain dislikes unfinished situations. It wants answers, resolution, understanding. When something feels unresolved, the mind often continues working on it long after the event itself has ended. That's why an argument from 3 days ago can suddenly reappear in your head. It's why you think of the perfect response hours after the conversation ended. Your brain isn't being irrational. It's trying to finish a story that feels incomplete. Think about how many important moments in life end without closure. Relationships end. Friendships drift apart. People leave without explanations. Opportunities disappear. Questions remain unanswered. Yet the brain doesn't like unanswered questions. So it creates simulations. Imaginary conversations become a way of exploring possibilities, a way of searching for meaning, a way of creating understanding when reality didn't provide it. This is especially common among people who think deeply. Deep thinkers often replay experiences longer than other people, not because they're obsessed, but because their minds naturally search for patterns, meaning, lessons, connections. A casual comment that someone else forgets in 5 minutes might stay in a deep thinker's mind for weeks, not because the comment was important, but because their brain is trying to understand what it meant. Another reason imaginary conversations happen is emotional processing. Imagine someone hurts your feelings. At the time, you say nothing. You smile, you move on, but internally the emotion remains. Hours later, your brain starts creating conversations. You imagine explaining how you felt. You imagine them apologizing. You imagine finally saying what was left unsaid. Psychology suggests that these mental simulations often serve an emotional purpose. They're the mind's attempt to process feelings that never found an outlet. But here's where things become interesting. Not all imaginary conversations involve the past. Many involve the future. You imagine an interview, a first date, a difficult conversation, a confrontation, a presentation. Why? Because your brain is preparing. Researchers often compare this to mental rehearsal. Athletes do it. Performers do it. Public speakers do it. The brain practices scenarios before they happen. In moderation, this can actually improve confidence and performance. Your mind is essentially running simulations, testing possibilities before reality arrives. However, there is a point where helpful rehearsal becomes something else. Overthinking. Instead of preparing once or twice, the brain begins repeating the same conversation over and over. The same argument, the same scenario, the same imagined outcome. Nothing new is being learned. Nothing new is being processed. The mind simply becomes trapped in repetition. This is where many people become stuck. What began as processing becomes rumination, and rumination rarely creates clarity. It creates exhaustion. Have you ever noticed that imaginary conversations often feel more satisfying than real ones? In your head, you always know what to say. You always explain yourself perfectly. You always find the right words. Reality is messier. People interrupt, misunderstand, react unpredictably. But imaginary conversations give us control. And sometimes that's exactly why they're so tempting. For a few moments, the world makes sense. Everything follows the script, even if reality never does. Now consider this. What if your imaginary conversations aren't really about the other person at all? What if they're about you? Many psychologists believe these conversations often reveal our deepest fears and desires. The argument you replay might reveal a need for validation. The future conversation you imagine might reveal anxiety. The apology you wish someone would give you might reveal a wound that hasn't healed. In other words, the conversation isn't always the point. The emotion underneath it is. And that's where the real insight lives. The next time you catch yourself having an imaginary conversation, pause for a moment. Don't ask, "Why am I talking to myself?" Ask, "What is my mind trying to resolve?" What question remains unanswered? What emotion remains unprocessed? What need remains unmet? Because often, the conversation itself is only the surface. The real message lies underneath. And perhaps that's why imaginary conversations are so common among thoughtful people. Their minds aren't just replaying words. They're searching for understanding, searching for closure, searching for meaning. Sometimes the conversation is about another person, but often, it's really a conversation with themselves. So if you've ever caught yourself replaying arguments, imagining future scenarios, or talking to people who aren't actually there, you're not alone. It doesn't necessarily mean you're broken. It doesn't necessarily mean you're overthinking. It may simply mean your mind is trying to understand something that still matters to you. And sometimes, understanding begins with the conversations nobody else can hear. If you've ever had an imaginary conversation, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring psychology, human behavior, and the hidden patterns shaping how people think, feel, and act, consider subscribing, because sometimes your mind is playing you.